was when I ruled the world.
So I have the honor to have a distinguished panel here with Stefano Firpo, who's the Chief of Staff at the Ministry of Development. Stefano has been really the engine behind the startup initiative at the ministry level, at the government level in Italy, under the Monti government, and continue to be the main sponsor at the Ministry of Development for further enhancement of anything that can support startup growth, startup funding in the country. And Kristof de Buysere, please. He's a Belgian scholar who devotes his entire academic, let's say, focus nowadays to equity crowdfunding and crowdfunding in general. So he's one of the few experts in the continent of this area of the law, which is all but settled right now, I think, worldwide. So let me start by, if I, okay.
It's not a television.
You know, lawyers have a difficult relationship with technology. This is why they put them on stage after lunch so that people can comfortably sleep for 5 or 10 minutes. And say that because people think the whole lawyers are like there are better lawyers. So you know, really the first country that had the idea of regulating funding portals. So portals, web portals, whereby a startup company can try to get equity contribution, has been the U.S. through, as you know, the Jobs Act. The phenomenon in the U.S. is, as you all know, subject matter of big debate and has enormous potential because of the money that can flow into that, which makes it also very, very difficult to regulate. The U.S. have probably the most refined set of regulations on the capital markets. So securities regulation in the U.S. is probably the most tested body of the law. And so creating exemptions created a lot of debate. And the secondary legislation that now the SEC has proposed to facilitate the functioning of funding portal is currently, I think, at a very advanced stage of development, but still not adopted yet and still subject to comments. What are the key drivers here? There are exemptions that allow issuers, so startup and small companies, to go on funding portals and seek funding with significant exemptions from the Securities Act. The SEC in particular, because of the size of the potential funding of startups through this relatively unregulated system, decided to put quite stringent limits on, in particular, each investor's money that can be put on that type of investment. This is probably designed to have a slower start of the phenomenon, to test whether abuses of these exemptions or lack of protection of investors could create real issues. The liability regime of funding portal is also very important, and the US has taken the position that some liability should remain on funding portals to ensure that not every startup company could try to solicit funding through funding portals. So very broad pool of companies that can use the crowdfunding opportunities, not too much money that each investor can invest on these initiatives, and somewhat stringent regulation, although the funding portals are now a regulated entity, like a broker-dealer or something else, but they have somewhat a ad hoc, stringent body of rules that apply to funding portals, and funding portals are expected to play a somewhat screening role in the selection of companies that can offer securities on the portal. Now, this is the US. I think we want to know where we in Europe are now in terms of understanding and regulating this. I think Kristof is best positioned to give us a little bit of an overview of where Europe is, and particularly the main countries, in terms of addressing the equity crowdfunding through funding portals opportunity that is currently presented as one of the channels to fund startup initiatives.
Okay, regarding regulation and crowdfunding, especially equity crowdfunding, I can say a lot of depressing things, but recently I can also say a lot of positive things. Perhaps let's first give the depressing part that you have an overview of where we are coming from. You need to keep in mind, I know you're not a public of legal people with legal skills, but you have to keep in mind that our regulations everywhere have a history in terms of stock exchanges, in terms of entities that were always accessed in an intermediated way through intermediaries. So that idea has also been heavily entrenched in all regulations in every country. But recently, a little bit more than 10 years ago, the internet came across. And in a number of industries, you see a trend towards disintermediation. You see it in the airline industry. You see it also, for instance, in marketplaces. Take eBay, for instance. eBay is the ultimate example of disintermediation. Luckily, eBay is about physical goods or services. They don't need to take any regulations in mind. If you want to sell securities, that's a different thing, because that was always the domain of the exchanges, and that was always the domain of the heavily regulated industries. Those industries didn't innovate. So an equity crowdfunding platform, what kind of difficulties did it face? To tell it in a very short period of time. First of all, if you have a company, most of the times you take a very cheap legal entity. That legal entity is not allowed to sell units to the public. First problem. Another problem, if you want to sell a unit or security to the public, then okay, there are European regulations, but there's still a lot of room for national regulation to fill in until a certain amount of money, and every country has another set of rules there. So that means that if you are allowed to sell your securities, the problem is that you face a different regime in every country. So, and today in the age of internet, it's a very, 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 very negative thing to limit yourself to the national boundaries. Another problem, for instance, if you want to run a platform, if you want to run like an eBay thing, then you easily end up in the domain of investment services regulations. Again, there we have European regulations, fine. The problem is we have national interpretations, because every country has its national regulator. For the same rule, you have 30 different interpretations. Then what is the result? A lot of platforms, equity platforms, try to engineer a solution around all these problems. Is that a positive thing? Yeah, perhaps because they at least they try to push things forward. They try to offer solutions. The negative part of it is that you don't necessarily end up with real equity. You end up with some kind of engineered instrument, an instrument that might not be investor friendly if you don't have a close look. but by doing so, by creating engineered solutions, the problem is then they end up creating something that is acceptable for the national regulator, but might not be acceptable for the interpretations of another regulator. So again, you face national boundaries. So that's the basic problem today. You have a lot of platforms. I wrote down the number. The numbers do not relate to equity crowdfunding. They relate to all types of crowdfunding. For instance, in France, we have 53 platforms. In Italy, 15. In the UK, 87. In Spain, 27. Then the Netherlands, 34. And in Germany, 26. So you have a lot of that are all types of crowdfunding: donation-based, lending-based, equity-based, reward-based, revenue sharing, if you want to consider it as a different type of crowdfunding. But the good thing is that you have platforms that try to push things forward, but the national boundaries are the biggest problem today. Okay, but then the positive part is that a few countries try to understand the domain, try to consider the positive aspects of it, while still considering, because one thing that will always pop into mind is, of course, investor protection. Here in Europe, the welfare states, investor protection is something that's considered very important. But still, you have a number of countries that try to understand domain and try to see the positive aspects for the entrepreneurial environment, and of course the positive aspects that the entrepreneurial environment creates for society at large. One of those countries is, of course, Italy. Other countries right now are UK, for instance. Although countries like France, Holland are also looking into it, but not to the same degree as Italy. Not to the same degree as Italy has done, not to the same degree as the UK is currently doing. So that's the positive part. People are taking things forward. But still, there is still a catch, of course. If every country starts to do things on their own, you still have the national boundaries.
So is it the right summary, at least as far as equity crowdfunding is concerned, that among the main countries in Europe, equity crowdfunding in particular is run by platforms that are licensed most of the time, mainly under banking or broker-dealer regulation, and then offer securities around the exemptions of the prospectus directive. And neither in the UK nor France nor Germany have yet an ad hoc regime for funding portals, which doesn't mean that activity is taking place. The UK in particular have a set of proposals that are sort of being discussed. France is approaching that. Germany has at least a position paper by the BaFin that explains how, with the existing rules, you can run a funding portal. There is one big exception to all of that, and I think one country that really stands up as an experiment, and this is in the context of a broader package that the Italian government under the Monti leadership launched in 2012. Stefano.
Yeah, I'm always glad to talk about Italy as an anomaly, and in this case, I think it's I take the perspective of a good anomaly, of a positive anomaly, I think. First, maybe it's good that I tell you a little bit of a story about the startup legislation. The startup legislation went through basically two channels. There was this important task force which produced under the previous government a very important report where the idea was to, designing a policy and suggest a policy in order to bridge the gap, just to mind the bridge, to bridge the gap between Italy and the rest of the world with regard to the startup legislation. In this regard was very much the suggestion was very much in line with the liberalization process, which was ongoing at that time in that government. So this task force produced a report, and I had to transform basically the report into norms. And that's where Pietro came, basically. And we had to define somehow.
For mistakes.
And so I remember still we met at his place in a torrid August, and we started to design the legislation. And while we were, opening up the legislation on the startups, changing, for example, the labor law for startups, changing the bankruptcy law for startups, changing the way how startups get credit in Italy, creating important fiscal incentive for the investments in the equity of the startups, and changing also somehow the civil code for startups, creating a huge exemption also in the civil code, so that startups can be more flexible in their governance processes. At that time, came up the idea to introduce in Italy an equity crowdfunding legislation. And why it happened on the startups? Just because it was a very innovative thing, somehow, and there was a huge resistance in the system, to push forward this innovation. The possibility to focus the pressure of the change on a very small area, which is the innovative startups area, created the opportunity to concentrate the pressure on a very small area and maybe to win the resistance. And that's how it worked, basically. So now Italy is is one of the countries which is ahead of the US and probably one of the most advanced in Europe in terms of the equity crowdfunding legislation. We have a primary legislation, but also a regulation from the Council, from the Italian CEC. We created an area where some exemption have been introduced, where funding portals, web-based funding portals, can operate to help innovative startups to get funding. Obviously, and somehow that if I after 1 year, just past 1 year since the legislation passed, and the results are quite encouraging. We have something a bit more than 1,300 innovative startups enrolled, and we have the first funding portal which has been regulated and licensed by the Council. So we are starting to see some results. Obviously, if somebody told me, "Are you happy with the current equilibrium that was found?" It's definitely true that so far the fact that the equity crowdfunding can be placed only on innovative startups is not a problem, but it's certainly something which can be changed, can be expanded somehow, and probably also in terms of the exemption, the number of exemption, we can also expand the area of exemption. But it was important to start, and now I think Italy has somehow a little bit of competitive advantages with respect to other countries in this field, and it was important to start creating a good market, to experiment this legislation on a very much selected area, and to prove that this legislation is working well without creating particular problems on investor protection, So we have to come up with a success story in order to further expand the legislation.
So basic principles of the Italian experiment are the following. First of all, this is not necessarily an experiment for crowdfunding in the sense that funding portals can attract crowds. That would require a lot more and probably attaches to fields like reward-based or lending that really sort of map the crowdfunding concept. This is really funding portal that can help innovative startups and hopefully in the future small businesses as in the US or elsewhere to issue securities or attract equity investment, only equity investment so far, through the web through entities that have limited regulation and in an area of the law that has some certainties. And the area of certainties are the following: that the issuer of the security bears the responsibility for its own information, and that the portal is not deemed to be an issuer. So, and second, that provided that the funding portal complies with some relatively limited rules concerning its own behavior vis-a-vis clients and governance, it does not bear responsibility for the information that the issuer has put out. So this could create a relatively easy regulatory framework for an experiment, and now open only to, as Stefano was suggesting, what is defined under Italian law as an innovative startup, that is a somewhat limited group of new ventures that can open a market for funding. Again, and I think this audience is particularly well equipped to understand the importance of this. This is not a tool that is designed to let's say lock out venture capitalists or angel investors. Quite the contrary. I think funding portals and the current legislation are a good tool to let, particularly in a diverse and geographically dispersed country like Italy, good initiatives known to people who have the appetite to understand the business of the company and to approach an investor that is presenting itself through a well-defined set of, let's say, information that the funding portal has to engineer for each of the startup, innovative startups that go into their funding portal. So it's a small experiment, but that is obviously based on some of the ideas behind the Jobs Act, that can provide a relatively low regulated environment for funding portals. But funding portals can also be managed by intermediaries, licensed broker dealers, banks. So the game is open, and everybody that has already met standards that are good enough to run a bank or a broker dealer can open a funding portal on their own. But also companies that have its mission of running solely a funding portal can do so and register with a special registry held by the Consob, and I think subject matter of a limited number of rules. Where are the limits? Well, my own take is that it's absurd to have a country, a continent that has broker-dealer regulations harmonized, that has security solicitation harmonized, that has a system of internal passporting and the single market for securities, and then that deal with funding portals and exemptions for startup, that is pretty much something global as we see today, as regulated on a national level. It looks absurd to me. So following maybe a suggestion that comes from the European Commission, in an open consultation. I think the task for all of us is now to propose a set of rules that could apply in every country and be as harmonized as possible, and subject to mutual recognition principles that would allow once again the EU to work as a single market. Kristof, what do you think issuers would care for in such a regulatory environment?
I know there are a lot of academic studies are currently looking into, because crowdfunding is brand new, of course there aren't a lot of academic studies that have been looking into it, but I know there are a few academic studies that are looking into it, what investors really consider important elements. And I was just looking to Twitter here, and there I saw something very important, also something that is demonstrated by those studies. A lot of people that invest in a crowdfunding project do not necessarily think like a normal investor, or let's put it that way, do not necessarily think like regulators or lawmakers think that an investor would normally think. By that I mean someone who invests in a crowdfunding project considers himself as somebody who's really connected with the project. That might be on a personal level, that might be on a level of interest, might be geographical level, and sometimes with the idea, okay, the project can go whatever direction it can go, even if it ends up bad, okay, too bad for me, nothing really happened. There's some level of connectedness, there's some level of membership feeling, and that is an element that you don't really have with traditional investors. Traditional investors, they only consider risk-adjusted returns, and for them investments are comparable. And that is something that is clearly not always the case in crowdfunding. That doesn't mean that people don't want to be protected, of course. They still want to have some level of protection. Why? Fraud will always be there, of course. But in general, the mental framework is different.
So mindset for investors' protection should not be as with our classical prospectus liability or issuers-driven sort of investors' protection driven by quality of information by the issuer in the classic type. I think this is a very clear indication, and it's interesting. I think the Consob in Italy with its own legislation did not seem to depart too much from the classic investors protection concepts, which is part of the ground that it can still cover. Kristof, do you want to?
There's one very interesting thing about that. Last week I was talking to somebody from the University of California at Berkeley, because University of California at Berkeley is currently starting one of the very first departments that is specifically focusing on crowdfunding. And I was talking to the person in charge there, and in many cases where regulators are currently looking into the investment protection issue, well, for many of those countries, not a single case of fraud was known, in fact.
Interesting. Because actually startuppers are much better people than than regular entrepreneurs. Comment from a lawyer. But Stefano, I think Kristof gave the investors sort of view angle in terms of regulation. What do issuers would care for, and what is really the advantage that an harmonizing regime can bring to issuers, also in terms of quality of investors that they may be seeking. We were discussing the I mentioned earlier one point that you made before of really a case for integration of investors type within the equity of a startup.
Yeah, I think this is the real challenge, because as a matter of fact, Funding Portal is pretty much a tool which now can be licensed, which now can be put into a position of working and creating opportunities for startups. But at the end of the day, I think that it should be an instrument which has a great potential of success, not by its own, but just integrating and by being complemented with the industry somehow. The industry being banks, the industry being venture capitalists, the industry being the seed capital operators, the industry being the angel investors operators. And this is, I think, is the key thing. So I really don't very much understand why somehow, not always, but sometimes some venture capitalists see this as this phenomenon as something strange and
There's one interesting feature of the Italian experiment, the concept of anchor investor. Can you shed some light on that concept and whether it's a subject matter of debate and criticized by many?
The idea there was on one side was a primary law provision which was introduced to increase the quality somehow of the.
What does it say exactly?
It says that 5% of the investment should be taken, should be acquired, should be funded by a professional investor, whether a bank or for example an incubator as well.
So I put it in more legal legal words. Funding through a funding portal that is addressed by an issuer to non-professional investors can close if and only if an anchor investor that is defined as a professional investor with some characteristics subscribe for at least 5% of the offered securities.
Yeah, exactly. And this provision has a double objective. One was to create some credibility in the offer, because once you offer something, once you offer a project and you look for capital on that project, you should be able to involve a professional investor, which somehow can help you in providing credibility to your project. But on the other hand, it was also imagined to integrate the systems, and to help the industry of professional investors to look at these instruments as a very interesting tool to operate and to raise in order to raise money on it. I would just add one more comment on Kristof comment about the disintermediation. This is a key thing, I think. We know very much that on the funding of innovative businesses, there is a huge problem of asymmetric information and this stuff, which somehow doesn't help the conventional, traditional providers of fund to help these businesses to grow and to get funded. So we need to think about the funding of these ventures using this intermediation mindset. And so this is another very important area where myself and the Ministry of Economic Development has devoted a lot of interest, because somehow the crowdfunding, for example, the crowdfunding legislation is very much in line with the reform on corporate bonds and on the disintermediation, which this country, particularly Italy, needs in order to open up all forms of alternative way of funding, which alternative doesn't mean against, the traditional providers of funds, but complementary to the system. And this is the key thing. And internet is just a major tool, but we have to find the proper balance. I think this is key, particularly in Italy, which is not the most brilliant story about investor protection, unfortunately. So it's very much important to find a good balance. And probably I agree with Pietro, the balance so far as being a little bit too conservative, maybe. But I'm also glad of that, because we have to move the first steps forward in a way that we create good stories, and we need good stories.
So I think if one wants to create a case for EU regulation on funding portals, the main element I would take from the Italian experiment is the idea that a new industry was created that has somewhat a clear regulatory picture. It is open to old players and newcomers. So it's itself a startup opportunity for smart developers of good technology and web-based solutions, and has a relatively clear regime in terms of liability attached, which is, I think, the key element. One has to provide startuppers who want to be, the screeners of initiatives and possibly the supporters of other startup initiatives, to rely on a relatively low risk regime. Otherwise, it would be difficult to attract interest and appetite for venture, which is all we need. Maybe some last word on, in particular, Europe. You mentioned so many websites that actually do lending crowdfunding, donation crowdfunding, and reward-based crowdfunding. I think the last is missing from the slides, but it's probably the most important, Kristof.
Especially if you look at, if you take, for instance, countries where equity crowdfunding couldn't develop because of regulations, and the major one is, of course, United States, of course. The single most important form of crowdfunding for entrepreneurs is reward-based crowdfunding. Kickstarter, Indiegogo, that's the ultimate reference point. It's also, perhaps I can relate that because at some moment in time during the discussion here came the look of venture capitalists and angels to crowdfunding. It's very interesting to see that for consumer products and software for the consumer market, reward-based crowdfunding, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, if you know the websites, is heavily used for as a validation mechanism. It's very easy to see if a project, if a product can have the interest of the public just by putting it online there, and then once the interest is there, then that can act as a kind of validation for other investors to step into this. The question, because it's lost there.
No, I think that's right. So again, I think reward-based crowdfunding could be a tool that is complementary to, or a first step towards equity crowdfunding. We need to make sure that regulation allows whoever is running a funding portal to be as flexible as possible in terms of activities that it can perform around classic equity crowdfunding. I would take a couple of questions from the floor, if you have any, and then turn to the next panel.
Jeff.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on how regulation can keep up with innovation. Question was,
how regulation will keep up with innovation in the space. My name's Jeff Lynn. I run an equity crowdfunding platform called Cedars in the UK. And my job is to keep innovating and to keep finding new ways to deliver the model to investors and entrepreneurs in ways that they like. Last month, we created a fund. It was people invested in 10 startups in a new incubator that they didn't know the identity of yet. I got a call from the FCA, which is our regulator in the UK, that was bewildered more than anything. They thought they'd figured out what crowdfunding was, and all of a sudden we produced a completely new version of it. And that's going to keep happening. Any thoughts on how, future-proof is a bold word, but how regulators can start to look at the fact that this is actually a very dynamic space and the models we see now are just the very beginning?
Jeff, I'll try to give you my thoughts. First, regulators have this challenge everywhere. But this presents an opportunity. I think funding portals, as most web-based businesses, have an opportunity, and this could be mandated by a regulation, to let users, investors in this, comment on, understand and comment and criticize. And if you have regulators who are fast enough to pick up the comments, I think this is an incredible revolution that is happening on web-based activities rather than other industries. You have a continuing source of information that is generated by the users of the systems. So if you make sure that funding portals have and host candid criticism and candid appraisal, or anywhere attract comments on other fora and then monitor them, and the regulators are, just have to hire some younger people and have the mentality. But what we see, for example, from the Italian experiment is that they actually like the idea that they will have to go over and over and modify the regulation as time progresses. I think this is not different from any other industries where innovation will be constantly ahead of the rules of the game. This is already in banking and in securities offering, but I think the web is a much more candid provider of comments and criticism, and I think regulators can benefit from them in easier ways than in many other industries. I don't know what Kristof and Stefano think about Jeff's comment.
It's been perhaps a good moment to do some self-criticism to people in the legal industry and in lawmaking and policy making. Those people always tend to think that the law can dictate business. That's the second nature of people. I'm sorry, but I think it's the truth.
But no, I think Kristof's point is one where he's saying, guys, and I think the Italian legislation has more than seats for that. Make sure funding portals have their own rules that try to detect and deter frauds, for example, which is the easiest, target of rules. So not every rule and not every enforcement action has to come to from a regulator or a law enforcement officer. The best enforcement is the self-enforcement by the funding portal based on the comments by the in other ways. I think this intermediation can also mean getting rid of agencies and state many times. Nothing against Stefano and the ministry.
No, it's just maybe because I just read a very nice book from Ian Ferguson, which is called, I think, Degeneration, something like that. And it's true, okay, the business is always ahead of regulation, and somehow regulation is always, trying to catch up. I've been working for many years on banking regulation, and all the Basel exercise was basically that one. But the problem is not regulation being, a bit behind. The problem is bad regulation. So it's and that's the point. You should, for example, for funding portals, you need a regulation, because without the regulation, there was no this opportunity. Okay, so regulation was an enabler of a business in this case. Then you need to have a good regulation, and I agree that in Italy particularly, this is one of the key issue in this country, that in many areas we have very bad regulation. But it's not about being against or pro regulation in itself. It's just to find the right balance and find the good rules in order to push forward good businesses.
And the balance between the enforcement by agencies in general and the courts and self-enforcement, really. Thank you very much for hosting a few remarks on crowdfunding regulation. Hope next time we'll report on more success and development and more clarity. And hope many of your ventures will be funded through portals. Bye.